Thanks everyone for joining for the last session. So I'm going to be giving an overview talk about star-planet orbital orientation. So we've talked about knowing your star, knowing your planet, and what I really want to try to drive towards is knowing our full system and thinking about what the relationship is between those planets and those stars. So I'm going to start with just an arbitrary planetary system here. And if we zoom it out and we flip it around and we say, okay, not all the orbits are necessarily aligned, so allow for a little bit of mutual inclination. I'm really going to be focusing on primarily just one aspect of this planetary system throughout this talk, and that's if you zoom in and look at this angle, this is something that we call the stellar obliquity. So when you look at your star, you've got a red-shifted side, a blue-shifted side. We've heard about this from several talks over the past couple of days. And there is going to be a rotational spin axis of your star that is not necessarily aligned with the orbits of your exoplanets. So specifically, the stellar obliquity is defined as this angle between your stellar spin axis and the net orbital angular momentum vector of your system. And this is actually not an angle that we generically know for our planetary system. So this is a term that gets used a lot. And I want to distinguish between this and the spin orbit angle, which is another term that you'll hear a lot. So what we usually measure is actually the angle between your planet orbit and your stellar spin axis. And that's what I would call the spin orbit angle. The stellar obliquity is actually this kind of system-wide value that is saying we know where all the planets are in our system, we know where the angular momentum lies, and we're able to actually figure out this system-wide view. And so this is really what we're going towards. We are hoping to get these stellar obliquities. Mostly what we have is spin orbit angles, and so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is really built off of these spin orbit distributions. So if we look at our solar system actually is kind of nicely approximated by several concentric rings. If you just look at the planets as sort of these rings that represent their orbits that are tilted just a little bit off from the way that their stellar host is spinning. So our sun spins about 6 or 7 degrees off from the plane of our solar system, our net orbital angular momentum axis. If you look at gas giant exoplanets, there are lots and lots of different orientations that have been seen that are in some cases very similar to that of the solar system, close to this alignment, and in other cases are very, very distinct. There are planets that are on sideways and backwards orbits that are very different from what we see in our own system. And so this brings up this question of what is actually causing that? What is that telling us about how our systems have formed? And also what the relationship is between how our orbits are evolving and our stellar host properties. So this is a figure that came up also in Song-Hu Wang's talk a couple of days ago that is just an overview of many different ways that you can misalign a planetary system. There are a lot of potential processes. You can sort of piece together which of these is most dominant by looking at what kinds of systems you see these spin-orbit misalignments in versus the ones where you don't see them. So I just wanted to start off with, there are ways that you can primordially spin-orbit misalign your system. You can have your disk get misaligned through either magnetic processes, through interactions with a companion star, through kind of asymmetric accretion in the star formation process. Or you can also have misalignments occur after formation, where you can say maybe you have multiple planets that form in the system and that interact with each other. You might have another star that's bound to the system that can help to flip around your orbits. And so this is another class of ways that you can misalign your systems. And when we look at these spin orbit orientations, we're really probing which of these is the dominant formation pathway and what is actually sculpting the systems that we see today. So what we want to know is this angle psi, that's known as the true spin orbit angle. Unfortunately, our planets are not all perfectly oriented in the ideal axis that we would want them to be in. And so what we actually measure is a combination of 3 angles that we need to rotate to get to this psi that we're interested in. We can't actually get all of these angles for many of our systems, and so in many cases you're going to end up seeing just lambda distributions, which is this sky-projected version of our true spin-orbit angle, but I'll walk through what we actually do measure and how we can get I naught, lambda, and I sub s that together we can use to get this psi. So I naught, is just this orbital inclination. We are fortunate in that most of the exoplanets that are known and confirmed do transit, and so this means that I naught is somewhat, it's almost trivial in that it sort of drops out of your transit model. If you found your planet, you've modeled its properties, you generally have I naught and you know it's close to 90 degrees because it is transiting. If you don't have a transiting exoplanet, you can also get I naught for example, wider orbiting astrometric planets. Kyle Franson mentioned yesterday AF-LEP-B has astrometric inclination measured. So if you're able to monitor your orbit and you're able to track your planet, then you can also get inclination that way. So now that we have inclination, I mentioned sky projected spin orbit angle is another one that we're going to see a lot. And this lambda is something that is most commonly measured using the Rossiter-McLaughlin effect. So this is this idea that since your star is spinning, it has a red-shifted side and a blue-shifted side. And if you, as BJ mentioned, take your entire spectrum and you turn it into a single radial velocity data point, then that point is going to look systematically slightly redder or slightly bluer if you're blocking out some fraction of the starlight. And so the Rossiter-McLaughlin effect is really sweeping a lot of this information about the star under the rug, and it's saying, we're just going to take our radial velocities, and they will look, using exactly the same pipeline, a little bit redder or a little bit bluer, if we just kind of assume that the system is being tracked in this way, and that we're just taking that all into individual RVs as opposed to kind of tracing out more of the stellar information there. So what this looks like in practice is either a symmetric signal if you are blocking out the red and the blue shifted sided evenly, or it'll look asymmetric if you're not. And this is something that is pretty dependent, whether you can actually see the signal, because it's pretty small. You're just blocking out a small fraction of your stellar limb. It's going to be something that's really easiest to do for big planets. And so we'll see that a lot of these observations are really biased towards hot Jupiters for that reason, although that's something that's been really changing over the past couple of years, which is pretty exciting. It's also biased towards higher V sin I, so that's another kind of important aspect of this to keep in mind. So this is just kind of a gallery of some Rossiter-McLaughlin observations that have been taken. Some of the people in this room have been involved in some of them. I just wanted to mention there are now hundreds of them that have been obtained. You can see some classic symmetric Rossiter-McLaughlin prograde orbits on the top. These are actually symmetric but backwards. So this is K2-290AB is orbiting backwards, and so you can see it's kind of inverted in the opposite direction, as well as WASP-17b. And so there's a pretty broad range of these that has been obtained. They're usually about a night of observations each, or sometimes just a few hours if you have a pretty nice short period hot Jupiter. A couple of other surveys that have gotten lots of these RM observations that I just wanted to quickly nod to. The GAPS program has been collecting these for a very long time now, over a decade. The DREAM program has recently been getting a lot of these RM observations for kind of hot Neptune type planets, and so starting to push towards these smaller exoplanets and publish those Rossiter-McLaughlin observations. And so this is just what some of those look like. Song-Hu and Shan Yu, who's going to be talking later in the session, and I have been working on this stellar obliquities and long period exoplanet system survey that was really kind of oriented towards augmenting the warm Jupiter population. So I'll talk more about some of those results as well. And it's not all just the RM. So I mentioned there's a lot of information that we throw away with this. You can also kind of visualize this in slightly different ways where you can figure out what fraction of your starlight is actually missing. This is often seen in these Doppler shadow, Doppler transit sort of observations where you'll see a signal that looks like this that is effectively telling you what your path is. So where is the missing light as your planet is transiting over your host star. And there's also a Rossiter-McLaughlin reloaded technique where you can actually sort of take your out of transit minus in transit spectra, and you can figure out what is the starlight that is missing behind what your planet is covering up. That is something that was pioneered by Heather Segla, who's also here. So a lot of really great ways that you can use this, and that you can do kind of tricky things to actually learn more about both your star and your planet, in addition to kind of the system as a whole. Okay, so this last angle is the stellar inclination. This is one that we traditionally get through stellar rotation periods, so we've also heard a lot about this throughout this week. So this is looking at photometry, looking at periodic rotation signals, and then combining that with our V sin I measurements that we generally get from spectra to back out what the inclination is of our host star. This is a little bit trickier than just taking arcsine V sin I over V, because V sin I and V are correlated, and so you have to handle your uncertainties carefully. But by taking those and doing sort of a proper Bayesian analysis of what inclination is, accounting for uncertainties properly, you can do this on both for individual systems and to get kind of a population of psi. I also wanted to mention, because Dan Huber mentions this, that you can also learn about inclinations from astroseismology. And this is a really cool sort of complementary idea of you can look at the inclination of your core in addition to the inclination of your surface. So this is sort of a subtlety. All of these other angles that I've been talking about are talking about your stellar surface and which way that is rotating relative to your orbits. But seismology gives you this extra piece of information about the interior structure of your star as well. And so you can put those together to actually get a much more comprehensive picture of how all of these angles are oriented, and there are multiple angles even for a given star. Okay, so putting all of that together, we can get our psi angles. I also wanted to mention there are lots of other methods. I will mostly focus on RM simply because it's the system that has gotten most of these measurements, and so a lot of our demographic studies fall out of the RM observations. But there are other observations that have been used. Rachel mentioned interferometry for tau Cetis, shown that it's probably pole-on. There are other ways that you can also touch upon this. And I also want to mention for star spots, Sabina Sagenbeva has a poster on that, so you should talk to her if you're interested in how you can get obliquities there. And if you don't look at just individual systems, there are other ways that you can also infer more about the obliquity distribution. So you can also look at just your V sin I distributions, and you can say, okay, well, sin I is going to be larger if you have an edge-on system. And so if you see systematically higher sin I for systems with planets versus not planets, that might mean that you have more edge-on systems, for example. So that's something that has been done in a couple of previous studies. You can also look at your rotation period amplitudes and say, okay, well, if it's edge-on, you're generally going to get higher amplitudes for your rotation periods. And then you can argue that certain types of systems are more edge-on than others. So these types of studies generally require quite large sample sizes. These are usually in maybe the hundreds or so. But that's another way that you can also approach this problem, not just from looking at many individual systems, but also from this demographic standpoint. Okay, so from this, what have we actually seen? So I put this in A over R star versus planet mass space because we'll hear from JJ that tides are actually really important in determining what kinds of systems we expect to be aligned or not. And so A over R star tells you basically how many stellar radii you are away from your host star, how much your planet is interacting with it. So if we kind of map out some of the space and what we know about it, if we start with our hot Jupiters, there is a seminal result from about 10 or 15 years ago at this point that showed that hot Jupiters around hot stars are often misaligned, and those that are around cool stars tend to be aligned. And we set this distinction between what we say is hot and cool at the Kraft break. This is somewhat observationally determined, but is also kind of a rotational discontinuity where you might perhaps expect that the behavior would be different. So you have convective envelopes around these cooler stars that are below the Kraft break. Above the Kraft break, you have radiative envelopes, and so perhaps the tidal interactions that you're getting between your host star and your planet are going to be different, and that could shape your obliquity distribution. This is something that has really held up. So 15 years later, this is what that same figure looks like. We're still seeing lots and lots of hot Jupiters that are misaligned around hot stars and not so many around cool stars. And so this is something that has been explained through kind of tidal theory. So again, JJ is going to talk more about one way that you can get that. Or you could say perhaps there might be some way that you can only really excite obliquities around hot stars and not cool stars. And so this is one of the main things that a lot of obliquity studies have been aiming to actually address. And another axis to this that I just wanted to briefly mention is that we showed a couple years ago that this distinction that we see at the Kraft break is really only significant when you look at the planets on circular orbits. And so it may be that there is a population of systems that are higher eccentricity and or higher inclination that are kind of all in their own group. So you can see all these lines, except for the purple ones, sort of are overlapping. And it's really just the circular orbit hot Jupiters around cool stars that tend to be aligned, and everything else is sort of more often misaligned. And so these are still, somewhat small samples. You can see top right here, we're still talking, a few to maybe tens of planets for each of these bins. And so it's really exciting to see that a lot more of these observations have been taken recently to start actually digging into how significant some of these trends that have been coming out are, and to actually put them into bins like eccentricity. Another result that I was pretty excited about that was recent was by Nick Saunders, that was showing that evolved systems that had stars that were once above the Kraft break, but that have since developed these deep convective envelopes, so they're now below the Kraft break. These are evolved stars that have hot Jupiters around them, are also so far near all aligned, although I think the poster that Ryan Rubenzahl showed has a potential challenge to this. And so this is a really cool way that you might be able to actually place some constraints on how long it takes to tidally realign. So if you believe that these systems may have started out misaligned and they are aligned now, then how long did you have to actually get from one place to another? Okay, so that's the hot Jupiters. I want to talk a bit about the warm Jupiters, since this is something we've been digging into recently. And the warm Jupiters, interestingly, don't seem to follow the same trends that we see for the hot Jupiters. And they hadn't really had as much love in terms of RMs until recently because they're just trickier to schedule. They don't transit as often, and we didn't know of as many because they're probabilistically less likely to transit in the first place. But that's something that TESS has really been changing. There are lots and lots more warm Jupiters that have been found. And as we've been finding more, we've been starting to fill in this space. And so this was a figure that I made during my PhD dissertation where I noticed that, weirdly, we seem to just kind of get this drop-off for our hot star systems above a period of about 5 days, where at that point we just hadn't seen anything that was very misaligned around hot stars, whereas around cool stars that didn't necessarily seem to be the case. So we decided to dig into this a bit more. And getting several more observations, we found that it looks like, at least in single star systems, so we're kind of tossing aside the binaries. I do love the binaries, so wherever Adam is, I love the binaries too, but for this purpose, we'll say, okay, they're too messy. We're just gonna think about the single stars. And in those single star systems, the warm Jupiters do tend to be aligned, and that's something that Shunyu will talk about more. So this was something from a couple of years ago, but since then, we've also been continuing to just monitor lots and lots more warm Jupiters. This is going to be the core of an upcoming talk, so I won't dwell on it, but when you account for stellar host biases, this also still seems to stand. Even if you look at eccentricity, the very, very eccentric warm Jupiters are also spin orbit aligned. And so this is, I would say, a pretty strong signature of your disks being aligned in the first place, where it's quite difficult to get just lots and lots of misaligned hot Jupiters and all aligned warm Jupiters if you have misaligned disks. There's no particular reason that your warm Jupiters would form in aligned disks and your hot Jupiters wouldn't. So this is something you'll hear more about, but that I think is one of the more exciting things that I personally have been very excited to learn more about and to try to dig into. And there have been many teams that have been continuing to get more of these warm Jupiter measurements as well. So in addition to this, if we just look at the full population, so it's trickier to do some of these divisions towards the smaller planets because there just aren't as many RM observations, but we can start doing it. We're getting more observations, and you can start digging into what those distributions look like as well. And so there have been a couple of interesting results that have suggested some potential trends here. This one's really for all of the RM observations, all of our spin orbit orientations. That was a result from a few years ago that suggested we might have a pileup of polar orbiting exoplanets. So this study started out with our lambda values and then went ahead and got rotation periods and inferred inclinations to get psi, or 3D angle, for all the systems where we could back in 2021. And they found this sort of pileup near 90 degrees as well as this aligned pileup with this gap that's in between. And this seemed kind of surprisingly significant at the time if it wasn't real. There was some back and forth that was in the literature that said, okay, well, for the systems that we actually could get inclinations for, they tend to be around hot stars. Oftentimes we actually get our inclinations through gravity darkening then. And if you get an inclination, you're actually biased towards having a misaligned system because you're only going to be able to see a very clear gravity darkening system, a very clear gravity darkening signature if you have a misalignment. So we do sort of have a bias towards these polar systems, but there has been more follow-up work that has kind of pushed back and said, okay, well, even if you throw away your inclinations, if you look at the types of systems where you expect to see potentially this peak of polar systems, so hot Jupiters around hot stars, low mass planets, there have been quite a few polar Neptunes that have been discovered. So Gumi is also somewhere in the audience has done a lot of work on this as well, as has Ryan Rubenzahl and some others. So this is also something that still seems to be fairly significant if you toss all of the systems that we don't expect to be misaligned anyways. It appears that we're still seeing some peak towards this polar trend, even accounting for the limb darkening. One other thing that I wanted to mention that is actually an undergrad-led result that came out of my group was that, and this has been sort of tentatively pointed out, but it's something that we've been pushing further on, is that single star systems above this mass ratio of about 2 × 10⁻³ are pretty much all aligned at this point. So this is that line here. And you can divide your systems up into hot stars and cool stars. And this is actually a binary, it turns out, XO3, and so it sort of doesn't belong in this plot in the first place. But it may be that we can actually put together this full range of all the way from the very small planets, the sub-Saturns and the Neptunes, all the way up to potentially even the brown dwarfs, and put them on this continuum and say, maybe it's actually mass ratio that is determining our rate of alignment as opposed to specific planet categories like I was showing earlier. Along these lines, transiting brown dwarfs, as we heard from Noah, are being discovered, and now we can actually start getting these measurements for them. This is just over the past about 4 months or so, there have been 4 new transiting brown dwarf RM observations that have actually just doubled the population of these measurements to date. And so far, they all appear to be aligned or very close to aligned. So whether that continues to hold up is a little unclear. You can see the Kraft break is located here, and so even the ones above the Kraft break so far appear to be spin orbit aligned. It's still early days, but there's lots to be done on this track as well. All right, so I wanted to briefly just mention that we can also look at systems that aren't necessarily transiting. So I focused on transiting systems simply because we have the most data for them. But if we look at the cold giants, we also have these spin orbit constraints that we have from astrometry. And you can look at, these are not necessarily all cold Jupiters, they're actually mostly brown dwarfs, but they are astrometrically monitored brown dwarfs as well as planets. And there's sort of a constraint where you can say, well, there's a minimum psi that you can have based on the mutual inclination that you get from rotation periods and V sin I, as well as a maximum psi. And so some of these, like for example, this one at the very bottom, are pretty well constrained to probably be quite misaligned. But again, this is something where there's certainly a lot more to be learned about these wider orbiting companions that hopefully we can learn from Gaia and from other upcoming surveys. Those are the 2 planets within this system, or this list. When we look at disk inclinations, this gives us kind of another axis that we can consider. Protoplanetary disks and debris disks, you can also do the same game of saying, okay, there's a minimum mutual inclination that you have based on V sin I, based on the rotation period of your host star. So it looks like there's tentatively some evidence for at least some disks being misaligned. I'm not saying 100% of all disks are misaligned. And interestingly, when you look at these, you're also probing sort of the inner disk because you're looking at inclination of your disk versus your stellar inclination. I want to mention that not all of your disk is necessarily aligned. So if you look at protoplanetary disk images, you'll see that there are these concentric annuli. They're not necessarily all lined up with each other. They can be mutually inclined. So this figure has nothing to do with stellar obliquity, really. It's looking at relative inclinations within systems that have multiple disks. But it's just sort of pointing to the fact that just because your inner system is aligned doesn't mean your outer system is, and vice versa. Okay, so I mentioned I've been completely ignoring the binaries. Sometimes our systems have friends, so they're not always alone, and this is really something that's just emerging, starting to understand the obliquity distribution in these binary systems in much more detail when we're chopping into smaller boxes than just looking at hot Jupiters as a full population. I wanted to mention that for these binaries, there are a lot of other processes that we need to take into account. In particular, these ZLK oscillations are going to produce a very natural way, actually, to produce these very, very large obliquities. And so that's the reason that we end up tossing a lot of these binaries for some of our studies. So I'll blaze past some of this. I just wanted to, there are lots of angles, too many angles, gets complicated. And there's probably a lot going on that's, ZLK, as well as kind of your disk can be torqued by your stars as well. You can get secular interactions. It gets a little bit messier, but I think there's a lot still to be done looking at these binaries and parsing these mechanisms and which make most sense for which systems. So there is a lot to consider. We have in the past mostly had to just toss everything into one box and say, we're gonna look at cool stars versus hot stars, and what is the difference between those populations. But we're really getting to a point where we can start parsing by, okay, well, what if we toss all the circular orbits, and what if we just consider different axes, rather than just putting them into two giant bins. So considering all of this jointly really does require a big sample that is what we're getting towards. We're getting lots and lots of these observations, and I'm really excited to see where that ends up going. So I will leave with some takeaways, and I will take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Malena. So let me encourage the junior members of the audience. I see lots of hands. So let's start from the right.
Hi, Malena, great talk. I was curious, have you considered looking at cluster membership of the stars to see whether stellar flybys could cause misalignment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not specifically looked into that, but I think that would be really interesting to check. Yeah. As far as I know, most of these are probably in the very local solar neighborhood simply because they're really bright stars. And so you get this boost in the signal to noise per RV, and you really are looking for the biggest signals that you have. So they're probably mostly very close to us, but it would be interesting to see if any of them are in different populations and if that's something that we can do more with.
At the front on the...
For the wonderful talk. So I wanted to ask about the mutual inclinations in the multiplanetary systems. In the transit surveys, we many times see a single transiting planet. Does it mean that it is a real single planet, or there are different planets which are out of a transit? So what is the probability for this to happen, and what is the typical dispersion of inclinations of different planets in the multiplanetary system?
Yeah, I would say that's a fairly complicated question because it depends on which types of multiplanetary systems you have. So for example, if you look at ultra short period planets where multiple planets could be transiting, but they could actually have slightly different mutual inclinations, you can actually get a good distribution there. In general, if you see a single planet transiting, that does not mean that it is your only planet in the system. And so we've seen from TTVs, we've seen from RV monitoring that there will often be other planets that are not going to be aligned. And whether we have a complete census for any individual system, well, I would say we probably don't know all the planets for sure in basically any system, including the solar system. Shout out to Planet 9. And so, I mean, it was mentioned that if there was an Earth-sized planet that was in the 51 Peg system, you probably still wouldn't have found it if it was just searched for in mining the RVs. And so, Yeah, that's really a big open question is which of the planets are missing. And so that's why I mentioned we don't generally know stellar obliquities because we don't actually know where all of our planets are in most of these systems.
Do you think it is physically realistic to have only one planet, like from formation-wise, that only one planet formed and we don't have any other planets whatsoever?
Is that physically realistic? I can't say that I've thought about that scenario enough to really say. I think it's unlikely. I would say Eve would actually probably have a better answer to that. But I would suspect that it's unlikely, but that's really just a hunch.
At the back. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. I'm Chris Lamb, University of Florida. I was wondering if you wanted to see how obliquity varied throughout, like, beyond the solar neighborhood. So, like, if RM is limited to like bright stars, nearby stars, do you know of other methods for trying to get a census of obliquity as it varies throughout, like beyond the neighborhood, throughout the galaxy?
Yeah, so if you're looking at more distant stars, you can do these inclination arguments or these V sin I arguments. So if you can get a constraint on V sin I, you might be able to say, like, for many systems, are they statistically more misaligned than some other population? This is a little tricky because you usually need a control sample, so you're usually measuring a pretty large number of systems. But the RMs, I think, are going to be really tricky once you're starting to get past V equals 13 or 14, unless you're really, really big planets. And so the upcoming surveys probably won't help too much with that, and we might have to rely more on these arguments of rotational amplitude trends and the V sin I trends.
Thanks.
All right, so let's thank Milena again.